After Game 6 of the 1972 World Chess Championship in Reykjavik, Iceland, Boris Spassky, world champion at the time, stood up from the board and applauding Bobby Fischer, the same man who had just defeated him in front of the whole world. That tells you everything you need to know about what kind of game this was. Pawn to c4 from Fischer, the English opening. Now, this is only the third time in serious tournament play that Fischer had opened this way, and for a player so committed to pawn to e4 that he once called it best by test, seeing c4 on the board was already a real terror for the Soviets, who had an undying support for Spassky. Spassky himself would have seen it and immediately known this wasn't going to be a familiar theoretical battle. e6 from Spassky, knight to f3, pawn to d5, pawn to d4, knight f6, knight c3, bishop to e7, and already the position is transposing. We see e3, h6, bishop h4, and this is no longer the English opening in any meaningful sense. The pawn structure, the piece placement, the strategic direction, it has become a queen's gambit declined, specifically the Tartakover variation, which arrives officially on move 7, when Spassky plays pawn to b6. And here, Fischer does something precise. He only releases the central tension now, after b6 has been played, capturing on d5 with the pawn. The timing matters. If Fischer had captured earlier, before b6 was played, the bishop on c8 would have had its classic diagonal open immediately. By waiting until b6 was played, until Spassky had spent a move on it, Fischer ensures that the recapture gives white the better structure going forward. A small detail, but exactly the kind of small detail that separates Fischer from every other good player. After pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, knight takes d5, pawn takes d5, the center has been clarified and a specific pawn structure has arrived. The dust settles and the game's real character emerges. Rook to c1 from Fischer. Immediately logical, pointing the rook directly at the c7 pawn and announcing his intentions on the queen side. Spassky responds with bishop to e6, which might look slightly unusual. Why not bishop to b7, using the diagonal that b6 was played to prepare? The difference is subtle. On e6, the bishop is protected, and it retains the option of going to f5 later, or even to g4 to harass a knight. On b7, it sits unprotected and somewhat passive, so bishop to e6 is the more ambitious choice. Queen to a4 from Fischer. And here is one of the most enjoyable threads running through this entire game. The white queen never stays still. She roams the entire board, and wherever she lands, that is where the action moves. Right now, she's on a4, adding another attacker to the queen side, which is now under pressure. Pawn to c5 from Spassky, challenging d4. Queen to a3 from Fischer. An uncomfortable pin now bears down on c5. Three pieces are attacking it simultaneously: the rook on c1, the d4 pawn, and the queen on a3. Spassky brings the rook to c8 for support. Bishop to b5 from Fischer, just sort of boxing out the knight on b8 while adding yet another piece for queenside pressure. Pawn to a6, but this is not yet a threat, since the rook on c8 is undefended, so Fischer doesn't need to react. Pawn takes c5, pawn takes back, and now the position reveals its next character: hanging pawns. They aren't really hanging in the conventional sense, since the queen and bishop protect them, but Spassky's pawns on c5 and d5 sit side by side in the center with no pawn support on either flank. They are not weak yet. Hanging pawns can be powerful, mobile, controlling space, but they need careful handling, and Fischer is going to spend the next phase of the game making them increasingly uncomfortable. Fischer castles, fully developed, completely harmonious. Rook to a7 from Spassky, the queen defending the rook, which now makes the a6 pawn capturing this bishop a threat. So Fischer plays bishop to e2, simply tucking it away on the safe square where it watches the center. Take a snapshot of the position at this point. The knight is on f3, a classic square. The bishop is on e2, clean and unobtrusive. The rook is perfectly placed on c1. The f-rook will soon go to d1. Black's rooks are disjointed,
The knight is still on its home square, the a6 pawn is isolated. After 17 moves, the difference in harmony between the two positions is already meaningful, and Fischer hasn't done anything dramatic to achieve it, just natural, precise, unhurried development. Knight d7, knight to d4 from Fischer, making use of the pin on the e7 queen. The knight drives into the center and forces a decision. Spassky retreats the queen to f8. Knight takes e6 from Fischer, pawn takes back. And now the position has a new character. That d4 square is open, and Fischer plays pawn to e4, the central strike that challenges Spassky's pawns directly. Something needs to be done. Spassky doesn't want to double pawns, so he plays pawn to d4, advancing the passer, keeping the center closed. Fischer responds with pawn to f5. The kingside pawns begin rolling, queen to e7 from Spassky, and then pawn to e5 from Fischer. The pawn claims space, and the e6 pawn is now static, immobile, a permanent target. That pawn is going to be on Fischer's mind for the rest of the game. Rook to b8 from Spassky, the rook no longer needed on the c-file and heading to pressure b2. Bishop to c4 from Fischer, repositioning, pinning the e6 pawn and eyeing the f5 advance. Spassky gets out of the pin with king to h8, then queen to h3 from Fischer. The queen sweeps from a3 all the way to h3, switching flanks entirely, now targeting the e6 pawn from a completely different direction. Knight to f8, retreating to defend e6, and now Fischer plays pawn to b3. Just b3. A quiet pawn move that, on first glance, seems modest, but look at what it accomplishes. Spassky's rooks are suddenly neutralized by that pawn move. What was going to happen on the queen side can now be completely forgotten. The game is happening on the king side, and Fischer has arranged things so that black's queen side cannot contribute to the defense. Pawn to a5 from Spassky, trying to peel open the a-file, get some counterplay, do something. But it's too late for ideas like that. Pawn to f5 from Fischer, and Spassky takes the pawn. The f-rook recaptures so it can later double on the f-file. Knight to h7 from Spassky, heading toward g5. Fischer doubles rooks on the f-file, then the queen retreats to d8. Queen to g3 from Fischer, and now pawn to h4. The h-pawn joins the advance, and the knight on h7 is in a pitiful state, completely restricted, going nowhere useful, while the bishop on c4 dominates every diagonal it touches. The difference between that bishop and the knight is not subtle anymore. It is overwhelming.
Pawn to e6 from Fischer, advancing further. Rook to c7 from Spassky, defending c5. Queen to e5 from Fischer, repositioning to a new attacking post. And now Spassky has essentially nothing to do. For most of what remains of the game, the queen simply shuffles between d8 and e8, unable to contribute meaningfully to any real plan. The position has been completely controlled. Pawn to a4 from Fischer, just preventing the possibility of black playing a4 and trying to crack open the queen side. Rook to f2 from Fischer, and then rook f3, and now the focus shifts to the long diagonal. Bishop to d3 comes into view. Queen e8, queen to e4. And now the threat of rook to f8 is building, a threat so serious that if the rook were to land on f8, the resulting sequence would end in checkmate. Knight takes rook, rook takes knight, removing the h7 defender. Queen takes rook, queen to h7, game over. Spassky tries knight to f6, hoping to create some resource, but Fischer takes the knight immediately, recaptures twice on f6, and the king is forced to g8. Bishop to c4 from Fischer, the king must leave the diagonal or allow the passed pawn to advance with a discovered check simultaneously. King retreats to h8, and now queen to f4 from Fischer, his 41st move. And here, Spassky resigned. The threats are immediate and multiple. Rook to f8 wins the queen, rook takes h6 check, queen takes h6 check is coming. Just to show one clean finish, if the king tries to come back to g8 to avoid the check and just to sort of protect this f8 square, then we have that queen takes h6 follows, and now the threat of rook to g6 check combined with the pawn advance leaves black with nothing. So now, if black just makes a passive move, then we have rook g6,
Rook blocks, pawn push with discovered check, queen must block, and now we can win by either promoting or capturing the rook with the queen here. But whichever way, it's over for Spassky. This game, as described by international master Anthony, is a symphony of placid beauty. So good that Spassky had to get up and applaud. However, this isn't really the first time Fischer chose an unexpected opening. So go over to this next video to see the craziest opening Bobby Fischer ever played. And of course, boop that like button. Thanks.